The deadly landscape. The shuttle's engines hummed softly as it descended toward the surface of the planet. Commander Mara glanced out of the small window, her eyes narrowing as the landscape below came into view. This was a world like no other, a planet of extremes, where every step could lead to a deadly encounter. It was a death world. Prepare for landing. Mara's voice rang through the ship's communication system, steady but filled with urgency. The rest of her team, a group of highly trained explorers, moved swiftly, securing their gear and making last-minute checks. They had trained for months to survive here, but even the best preparations couldn't guarantee safety. The death world was unpredictable, and no one truly knew what lay beneath its surface. As the shuttle touched down with a soft thud, the ground trembled, as though the planet itself was alive and aware of the newcomers. The team gathered their equipment and moved quickly toward the hatch. Mara was the first to step onto the ground, her boots crunching against the hard, rocky surface. The air was thick with a strange, metallic scent, and the sky above was an eerie shade of red, casting an unnatural glow over everything. "Stay close, stay alert," Mara ordered, her voice calm but firm. "This world is hostile in ways we can't even imagine." Her team nodded, adjusting their weapons and scanning the area. The air was dense, and the heat radiating from the surface made it feel as though the planet was alive, breathing with them. As they moved further into the barren landscape, the ground began to shift beneath their feet, as if the world itself was changing. Jagged cliffs rose in the distance, and strange, twisted plants grew from the cracked earth. It was a landscape that looked like it belonged to another time, another world entirely. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the air. The team froze, their eyes darting to the source of the sound. A massive creature emerged from behind a large rock formation, its red eyes glowing with hunger. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, its body covered in thick, armored scales, and its mouth full of sharp, glistening teeth. It stood on two legs, towering over them by several feet. Mara's hand instinctively went to her weapon, but she didn't fire. Not yet. She had learned the hard way that in a world like this, it was often best to wait and observe. The creature didn't move immediately. Instead, it studied them, its eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air. It could sense their presence. This was a predator, and it was not going to let them leave without a fight. Slowly, the creature began to advance, its movements deliberate and calculated. Mara raised her hand, signaling her team to stay still. They had been trained for moments like this. They knew that sometimes the best strategy was to remain calm and wait for the right moment. The creature moved closer, its heavy footsteps echoing in the silent, oppressive air. "On my mark," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. Her team nodded, ready to act. Every muscle in their bodies was tense, prepared for the moment when they would need to spring into action. But before they could do anything, the creature lunged. It happened so quickly that there was no time to react. The beast's claws slashed through the air, aiming for Mara's team. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its swipe, and in that split second, everything exploded into chaos. The team scattered, moving in all directions to avoid the creature's attacks. Mara fired a shot at the beast, but it barely seemed to faze it. The creature roared in fury, its tail whipping through the air, knocking one of her teammates to the ground. Another teammate quickly moved to help, but the beast was relentless. Its claws raked across the ground, sending up sparks as they scraped against the rocky surface. "Get up," Mara shouted, trying to keep her composure. "We need to fight back." One of her team members, Lieutenant Harris, fired a powerful blast at the creature's exposed side. The shot hit its target, but the beast barely flinched. It was going to take more than a few blasts to bring it down. Mara's mind raced. They had no choice but to fight. They had prepared for this, trained for it. She quickly assessed the situation, her eyes scanning the surroundings. There was no way they could defeat the creature with brute force alone. They needed strategy. They needed an opening. "Team, spread out," she commanded. Find its weak spots. Aim for the eyes, the throat, anything vulnerable. The creature growled, its eyes locked onto Mara as it advanced. It seemed to sense that she was the leader, and it was focused on taking her down. But Mara wasn't about to give up. She moved quickly, ducking behind a large rock, and raised her weapon once more. With a steady hand, she aimed for the creature's eye. It roared in pain as the shot struck its target. The beast staggered back, momentarily blinded, and that was all the team needed. Harris took the opportunity to charge, his weapon firing rapidly. The creature's defense weakened, and with one final shot to its heart, it collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Mara's breath came in short gasps as she surveyed the aftermath. Her team was shaken but alive. They had survived their first encounter with the deadly wildlife of the Deathworld, but they knew this was just the beginning. They were on a planet where every moment could be their last, and they needed to remain vigilant. They had come here to uncover the truth about how humans could survive on a world like this. But the secrets of the Deathworld were still waiting to be uncovered. "Stay focused," Mara said, her voice steady once more. "We've only just begun." The team nodded, knowing that the real challenges were only beginning. But for now, they had won their first battle on the Deathworld. And that was enough to give them hope. For now, the hidden forces. After the fierce battle with the deadly creature, the team took a moment to catch their breath. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt ozone and the tension that came from narrowly escaping death. Mara wiped her forehead, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any other threats. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving. "Move out, keep alert," Mara instructed, her voice firm. This was just a warning. The planet will throw more at us. The team nodded and gathered their gear, carefully stepping over the remains of the beast. Its massive body lay still, a reminder of the danger lurking at every corner of the Deathworld. They couldn't afford to let their guard down for a second. As they walked further into the planet's harsh terrain, they began to notice something strange. The landscape, though desolate and barren, seemed to have an unnatural quality. Jagged rock formations rose up like giant spires, casting long shadows across the ground. The air crackled with an eerie energy, as if the very planet was alive, watching them. "This place doesn't feel right," Lieutenant Harris muttered, his voice uneasy as he adjusted his weapon. "It's almost like the planet is alive." Mara glanced at him, her mind racing. She had felt it too. The sense that something far greater than the creatures they had just encountered was watching them. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. The mission came first. "We're not here to speculate," she replied, her voice clipped. "We need answers. We'll push forward and find out what's really going on here." As they continued on their journey, the silence was deafening. The planet's desolate beauty was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, with nothing but the occasional gust of wind to break the stillness. But that silence was unsettling, like the calm before the storm. The team reached a high ridge that overlooked a vast valley below. From their vantage point, they could see a large structure in the distance, something far too perfect to be natural. It was a massive, dark shape that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was unlike anything Mara had ever seen before. "That's our next destination," Mara said, pointing toward the structure. "We need to check it out. It could hold the answers we're looking for." As they made their way down the ridge, the temperature began to drop, and a heavy fog rolled in from the valley. The ground beneath their feet became slick, making every step feel like a struggle. But despite the conditions, Mara pressed on. Her instincts told her they were getting closer to something important. "Keep your eyes open," Mara warned. "We don't know what we're walking into." The fog grew thicker, and the world around them seemed to disappear. The team stayed close, moving carefully through the dense mist. It felt as if the air itself was thickening, closing in on them. Every noise was amplified. Footsteps crunching on the ground, the sound of their breathing, even the faint hum of their equipment. As they drew closer to the structure, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The building loomed ahead, casting a long shadow over the valley. It looked ancient, its stone walls weathered by time. Yet there was something about it that felt wrong. The very air around it seemed charged, as if the structure was emitting some sort of energy that was affecting everything nearby. "This is it," Mara said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're about to find out what this place really is." The team moved cautiously toward the entrance, where large ornate doors stood wide open. The doorframe was adorned with strange markings, symbols that none of them could recognize. But one thing was clear: this was no ordinary structure. It had been built by an advanced civilization, one far beyond anything the humans had encountered. Mara motioned for her team to follow her inside. They stepped through the doorway, and the moment they did, the temperature dropped even further. It was as if they had stepped into a different world entirely. The walls of the structure were lined with intricate carvings, and strange, glowing crystals illuminated the space with a soft, eerie light. As they moved deeper into the structure, they began to hear a low rhythmic hum, like the heartbeat of the planet itself. It was coming from further ahead, deep within the heart of the building. "Something's in there," Harris whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What is that sound?" Mara's pulse quickened, but she pushed her fear aside. She had a mission to complete. The team moved forward cautiously, following the sound of the hum, which grew louder with each step they took. They rounded a corner and came upon a massive chamber. In the center of the room, a large glowing sphere floated, surrounded by ancient machinery that seemed to pulse with energy. The sphere radiated power, an unnatural, almost malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of Mara's neck stand up. "Is that alive?" one of the team members asked, his voice trembling. Mara stared at the sphere, her mind racing. This was no ordinary energy source. It was as if the entire structure was built around it, designed to harness its power. Without warning, the sphere pulsed, sending a shockwave of energy through the room. The team stumbled back, and the walls around them began to tremble. It was as if the entire structure was coming to life. "We need to leave now," Mara shouted. But as they turned to flee, the entrance they had come through was sealed shut, trapping them inside. The hum grew louder, the energy in the room building to a deafening crescendo. Mara's heart raced as she realized they were no longer in control of their fate. The Deathworld had revealed its first secret, and it was much more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The awakening of the Deathworld. The runes shuddered, the walls vibrating as the humming intensified. Mara's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to her team. Panic flickered in their eyes. They had no way out, and the structure seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "What is happening?" Lieutenant Harris shouted over the deafening hum. His voice was tinged with fear, something Mara had rarely heard from him. Mara clenched her fists. "Stay calm," she commanded, though her own nerves were stretched thin. The team huddled together, backing away from the sphere that seemed to command the very air around them. Suddenly, the hum shifted, becoming a deep, resonating vibration that made the floor beneath their feet tremble. The sphere in the center of the room flickered with bright pulses of light, its energy surging. The air became thick, almost tangible, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with power. The heart of the Deathworld. The narrow passageway seemed to stretch on forever. Mara's breath came in ragged gasps, the air growing thinner with each step. The walls pulsated with an eerie, almost rhythmic energy, as if the very bones of the planet were alive and aware of their every movement. The strange, glowing substance from the sphere had spread further into the passage, illuminating the way ahead with a faint, unnatural light. The team moved cautiously, every footstep echoing loudly in the silence. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of energy vibrating through the walls, resonating deep within their chests. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. Retreat was no longer an option. Mara's mind raced. They had come here to gather information. No one had expected a deadly force like this. The structure had been ancient, But its power was far beyond anything they could have anticipated. The sphere was only the beginning, and now they had to face the consequences of disturbing it. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the passage, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The walls seemed to shift again, and Mara's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Move faster," she barked, her voice cutting through the tension. "We need to get to the end of this tunnel now." The team picked up the pace, urgency fueling their every step. But as they rounded the next corner, they froze. Before them stood a massive open chamber, far larger than any room they had encountered so far. The walls of the chamber were made of the same strange, black stone, but here the glowing substance had thickened, forming intricate patterns that shifted and flickered like living, breathing veins. In the center of the room was a platform, rising above the ground in the shape of a dark pyramid. And at the heart of the pyramid was a figure encased in crystal. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure. It wasn't human. No, it wasn't even anything she had ever seen before. It was tall and slender, its body wrapped in the same glowing substance that coated the walls, suspended in a state of unnatural stasis. It was as though the being was frozen in time, yet still alive, its presence radiating a powerful, malevolent energy. The entire chamber seemed to be focused on it, like the planet was offering up its life force to preserve this being. "We need to get out," one of the team members said in a hoarse whisper, fear seeping into his voice. But Mara didn't move. Her instincts screamed that this was no ordinary discovery. This wasn't just a ruin or an artifact. It was a key. The key to understanding what the Deathworld truly was, and more importantly, how to survive it. The figure in the crystal flickered, its eyes suddenly glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The energy around it pulsed faster, as if it had sensed their presence. The very air around them seemed to constrict, and Mara could feel a weight pressing on her chest, the pressure building. "Get back," Mara shouted, but it was too late. The crystal that encased the being cracked open with a violent roar, sending shards of crystal flying in every direction. The energy in the room surged, and the entire chamber seemed to tremble as if it were about to collapse. The team scrambled to take cover, ducking behind the jagged edges of the walls. But Mara didn't move. Her eyes were locked onto the being now standing before her. The air was thick with power, dark, chaotic power. The figure's body seemed to shimmer, shifting between solid and liquid, its form flickering like a broken image. And then, in a voice that reverberated through the very walls of the chamber, it spoke. "You have awakened me," the being said, its voice smooth, yet alien. It wasn't speaking in any language Mara recognized, but somehow she understood. The meaning was clear. "You have awakened the Deathworld," it continued. "And now, you will pay the price." The air around them crackled with an unnatural force, and Mara felt the ground beneath her feet shake violently. The team struggled to keep their balance, fear gripping their hearts. The figure raised its arms, and the very stone walls began to tremble. The energy from the crystal had awakened it, and now the planet itself seemed to come alive in response. "We need to leave," Harris shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Now." Mara's mind raced, but she didn't move. She couldn't. They had come this far, and they couldn't back down now. There was something here, something beyond this creature, beyond the energy of the planet, that they needed to understand. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about unlocking the truth of the Deathworld. The figure's glowing eyes locked onto Mara, and for a moment, everything went still. A strange, silent understanding passed between them. The being knew what they were after, and it wasn't going to let them leave with the answers they sought. "Foolish humans," it hissed, its voice filled with both contempt and curiosity. "You do not know what you have unleashed." Before Mara could react, the creature raised its hand, and the energy in the room intensified, pulling the team into a forceful vortex. The walls seemed to fold in on them, warping reality itself. The ground beneath their feet vanished, and they were falling. No, they were being pulled into something far greater than they had ever imagined. The Deathworld had awakened, and it wasn't just a planet. It was a living entity, and now it was hungry for their souls. The Deathworld's wrath. Mara's world spun violently as the ground vanished beneath her. She tried to scream, but the force of the vortex pulling them deeper into the planet's core stole her breath. Her team members were being pulled alongside her, their bodies twisting in midair as the reality around them seemed to warp and distort. The walls, the ceiling, and even the floor were all melting together, stretching and collapsing in impossible ways. It was as if the entire structure, the planet itself, had become a living thing, and it was trying to swallow them whole. In the blink of an eye, the vortex released its grip, and they were hurled to the ground. Mara landed hard, pain shooting through her limbs. She struggled to push herself up, her vision blurry, but the disorienting pull of the vortex had left her feeling disoriented. The air was thick, heavier than before, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with some unseen force. As she regained her bearings, she could see that her team had landed around her. They were shaken, disheveled, but alive. For now, they were in a vast chamber that stretched beyond the horizon. The walls were no longer just stone. They were covered in a strange, living material that pulsed and shifted in rhythm, with the energy emanating from the depths of the planet. "Where are we?" Harris gasped, his voice trembling as he stood up. He glanced around nervously. "What is this place?" Mara looked up. The massive chamber was unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky above them was no longer the sky. There was no sky. It was just darkness, a deep, unyielding black void that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls, covered in veins of glowing energy, seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding like the chest of a great beast. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the strange material beneath her feet. Her mind raced. They weren't just in a room. This was something else, something far bigger than any structure they had encountered. It was alive, and worse, it was aware of them. "This is no longer just a ruin," Mara muttered, her voice thick with dread. "This is the heart of the Deathworld." Before anyone could react, the ground began to shake again. The sound was deafening, a deep rumble that reverberated through their bodies. The energy in the chamber flared, its pulses quickening. The walls themselves seemed to come alive, their glowing veins pulsing with increasing intensity. A low, menacing growl filled the air. From the shadows ahead, something began to stir. Figures, huge, hulking shapes, emerged, moving slowly toward them. The figures were like nothing Mara had ever seen. Their bodies were massive, covered in thick, armored plating, and their eyes glowed with a harsh, unearthly light. The creatures were not of flesh and bone, but of living metal, their forms an amalgamation of organic and mechanical parts, twisted together into nightmarish shapes. They moved with an eerie, unnatural fluidity, and each one was carrying weapons that seemed forged from the very fabric of the planet. Mara's heart skipped a beat. These weren't just guardians or protectors. They were soldiers, and they weren't here to ask questions. "They're coming," Harris shouted, his voice filled with panic. "We need to fight back." "No," Mara shouted back, her voice urgent. "We don't have time for that. We need answers." The first of the creatures stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto Mara. It raised its massive weapon, a heavy blade that crackled with the same energy as the walls. The air around them seemed to bend, the force of the blade's charge creating an oppressive weight in the atmosphere. "Stop," Mara commanded, though her voice wavered. "We don't want to fight." The creature didn't pause. It swung the blade in a Y-arc, sending a shockwave of energy toward them. Mara's instincts kicked in. "Get down," she shouted, diving out of the way just as the blast hit the ground. The force of the strike shattered the ground, sending pieces of stone flying in every direction. The team scattered, but Mara remained focused. The creatures were formidable, but they were controlled by something far more powerful than them. And then it clicked. The figure in the crystal, the one they had awakened earlier, it was the source. This creature was a guardian, and it had been guarding the heart of the planet. The planet was alive, but it wasn't just a living entity. It was being controlled. She needed to understand how. "Fall back," Mara shouted to her team, signaling for them to regroup. "We need to find the control center, the source of the power." But as they turned to move, the chamber around them began to warp and shift again. The floor cracked, and the very ground beneath their feet began to rise and fall like waves. The planet was alive, and it was fighting back. A deep voice echoed from the shadows, its resonance sending a chill down Mara's spine. The figure, the one in the crystal, was speaking again, its voice reverberating through the chamber like an ancient, forgotten god. "Foolish humans," the voice boomed. "You have awakened the heart of the Deathworld. And now you will pay the price for your intrusion." Mara's heart raced. She knew they had to find the source and stop it before it was too late. But time was running out. The Deathworld had woken, and its wrath was now fully unleashed. The heart of darkness. Mara's heart raced as the ground beneath her feet trembled. The very air around them felt charged, heavy with an unnatural energy that weighed down on their bodies like a physical force. The creatures, living sentinels of the Deathworld, had not stopped their advance. They moved toward the group with deliberate, unwavering precision, their glowing eyes fixed on Mara and her team. Harris, his breathing labored and shaky, pulled out his weapon, but Mara quickly grabbed his arm. "No," she hissed. "We don't need to fight them. We need to understand what's controlling them." Harris looked at her, confusion and fear in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "These things err." "I know," Mara interrupted, her gaze fixed on the approaching creatures. "But this isn't about them. It's about the planet. The Deathworld itself is alive, and it's being controlled. These creatures are just pawns." The words hung in the air for a moment before the first of the creatures lunged, its massive blade aimed directly at Mara. Time seemed to slow as the creature's blade swung toward her. Without thinking, Mara ducked, barely avoiding the strike. The energy of the blade left a streak of crackling light in the air, the heat from it burning the ground where it landed. "We need to get to the source of this power," Mara shouted to the team, already on the move. "Come on." With little more than a glance at each other, the team followed her, sprinting as the creatures gave chase. The ground continued to shift beneath their feet, causing them to stumble and fall as they ran. They were running out of time. The creatures were relentless, and the pressure of the planet's energy was growing stronger with every step. Mara's mind raced. Where could the source be? How could they shut it down before it was too late? As they rounded a corner, they saw it. At the far end of the chamber stood a colossal structure, an altar-like formation. It was made of the same pulsating black stone, but this time, the energy was even more intense. At the center of the structure stood a massive sphere, surrounded by veins of glowing light that snaked through the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. The sphere was the heart of the Deathworld, and it was the source of the planet's power. Without hesitating, Mara rushed toward it, the others following close behind. The creatures were not far behind, and the sound of their heavy footsteps sent a shiver down her spine. "Get to the sphere," Mara shouted. "We have to destroy it or disable it. Now." They reached the base of the structure, and Mara immediately began to analyze the sphere. It was smooth, black, and impossibly large, almost as if it were alive itself. The energy pulsing from it felt suffocating, like a living, breathing entity that could crush them with a single thought. "We can't just destroy it," Mara said, her mind racing. "This is far more than a simple power source. It's connected to the planet itself. If we destroy it, we might." Before she could finish her thought, the sphere began to glow even brighter, the pulsing energy intensifying to an almost blinding level. The air itself crackled with static electricity, and the ground beneath them vibrated with such force that it was hard to keep standing. "Mara, it's too late," Harris yelled, his voice panicked. "We need to leave, now." But it was already too late. The sphere emitted a deafening sound, a deep, resonant hum that shook the very walls of the chamber. The glowing veins running through the walls of the structure flared, and the creatures surrounding them froze. The power was overwhelming, its presence suffocating and all-encompassing. The voice of the creature they had awakened echoed through the chamber again, but this time it was no longer calm. It was filled with rage. "You thought you could stop it," the voice boomed. "You thought you could control the Deathworld, but you have only fueled its wrath." Mara felt the weight of the words pressing on her chest. She knew what this meant. The Deathworld was beyond their comprehension. It was not a force that could be controlled. It was a force of nature, older and more powerful than any civilization, human or otherwise, could ever hope to understand. The sphere began to pulse faster, the energy growing stronger, surging through the very walls of the chamber. The ground cracked open, sending massive fissures through the stone. It was as if the planet itself was shaking with fury, a living being in agony, torn apart by its own power. Mara felt the air grow thin, and she could hear the frantic breathing of her team as they struggled to remain upright. They couldn't survive this. They couldn't escape. And yet, in the back of her mind, a spark of hope flickered. The creature that had been frozen in the crystal, the one they had disturbed, was the key. They had to reach it. They had to find a way to communicate with it. But time was running out. The energy in the sphere reached a peak, and Mara felt the pressure building, as if the entire planet was about to implode. "Move," she shouted. "We need to get back to the crystal, now." With no time to lose, they turned and ran, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The walls around them groaned under the weight of the power surging through them. The creatures were still coming, their glowing eyes fixed on them as they ran toward the chamber where the crystal had once held the figure. But as they neared the entrance, a blast of energy shot through the air, slamming into the ground beside them. The shockwave sent them flying, and Mara's body slammed into the stone wall, pain exploding through her side. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself up, determined to keep going. The crystal was their only hope. "Stay with me," she shouted to her team, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't stop now." The Deathworld's wrath had already begun. They had awakened something ancient and powerful, but it was still possible. They could still change the fate of the planet. If only they could reach the heart of the Deathworld before it was too late. The final battle. The roar of the Deathworld echoed through the vast chamber as Mara and her team stumbled toward the crystal. The ground beneath them was cracking, and the walls seemed to be closing in, as if the very planet was trying to swallow them whole. The power of the sphere surged, threatening to tear the entire chamber apart. The creatures, those living sentinels, were still pursuing them, their heavy footsteps reverberating like thunder. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. She knew they were running out of time. The crystal, the heart of the Deathworld, was their only chance, but getting to it meant navigating through a maze of collapsing corridors and relentless enemies. Each step they took felt like it could be their last. "Keep going," Mara shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We're almost there." But her words felt hollow, drowned out by the howling of the planet and the crashing of the walls around them. They were being hunted, and the creatures weren't going to stop until they were either dead or captured. The team pushed forward, their breathing ragged, but their determination unwavering. They were so close to the crystal now. Its dark form loomed ahead, glowing with an eerie light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the planet's frantic energy. The crackling air grew thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere were waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then suddenly, a massive figure blocked their path. It was the leader of the creatures, towering over them with glowing red eyes that burned like twin suns. Its massive claws scraped the ground as it approached, its weapon, an enormous jagged sword, raised high, crackling with energy. Mara froze for a moment, but then her instincts kicked in. She had no time to waste. They had to reach the crystal before it was too late. "Cover me," she shouted to the team, even as she started sprinting toward the crystal. The others hesitated for only a moment before they turned and opened fire on the creature. The air was filled with the sharp, crackling sound of laser shots and the screech of energy blasts as they tried to slow the creature's advance. But it didn't even flinch. The creature's armor absorbed the attacks, and it was clear they wouldn't be able to stop it with their weapons. Mara, however, wasn't stopping. Her legs burned with each step, but she pushed through the pain. She could see the crystal now, its pulsing energy just a few feet away. The creature behind her growled, its steps heavy as it followed, but she wouldn't stop. Not now. She reached the crystal, her hand reaching out toward it. And then, with a crack, the world seemed to shudder. The energy from the crystal surged into her, and for a moment, she felt weightless, her vision blurred, her mind filled with flashes of ancient memories. She saw the planet's history, its rise, and its fall. She saw the beings who had once lived here, their power, their mistakes, and she saw the death of their world, their desperate attempts to escape the fate they had created. But there was hope. There was always hope. The energy from the crystal poured into her, and with it came understanding. She knew now what had to be done. The leader of the creatures lunged at her, but before it could strike, Mara's hand shot out, a brilliant burst of light erupting from the crystal. The energy shot through the creature, sending it flying back into the wall with a deafening crash. The air around Mara crackled, and she felt a surge of power unlike anything she had ever experienced. She turned to face the rest of her team. "It's working," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The crystal, it's connected to the heart of the planet. It's alive, and we can control it." The team stared at her, disbelief written across their faces, but there was no time to explain further. The planet was still collapsing around them. "We need to shut it down," Mara continued, her voice urgent. "The power is too much. We have to stabilize the core before it destroys everything." With the crystal in hand, she knew they had the means to do it. The Deathworld had been awakened, but with the right focus, they could restore balance. They could save the planet. But as the team scrambled to make sense of their next move, a loud roar echoed from the depths of the chamber. Another wave of creatures appeared, larger and more menacing than before. It seemed like the planet was unleashing its full wrath, sending its last guardians to stop them. "Get to the control room," Mara ordered, her heart racing. "We'll hold them off. You have to stop the core." The battle that followed was unlike anything they had experienced. The creatures attacked with brutal force, each blow from their massive weapons sending shockwaves through the air. But the team held their ground, fighting with everything they had. Mara's mind was racing, trying to focus on the task at hand. She needed to understand how to stabilize the core, how to stop the Deathworld from tearing itself apart. With each passing moment, the planet seemed to grow angrier and more violent. The creatures were relentless, and their attacks became more vicious. But Mara wasn't giving up. She had come too far. They had come too far. She focused on the crystal, channeling its energy. She felt the power surge through her once more, and this time, she guided it, directing it into the core. "Now," she shouted to her team, her voice echoing in the chaos. "We've got one shot." The team worked together, their efforts coordinated with precision. The control room systems hummed to life, responding to the power Mara had unlocked. The crystal's energy flowed into the core, stabilizing the planet's unstable power. The creatures faltered, their movements slowing as the energy began to settle. The planet's wrath started to subside, the tremors calming. And then, in a final surge, the heart of the Deathworld pulsed once more, before the light faded to nothing. It was over. The Deathworld had been tamed. Mara stood, breathing heavily, looking at her team. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive. The planet had been saved, and the creatures had ceased their attacks. The team had done it. They had survived the impossible, and they had changed the fate of a Deathworld forever.